I told Gary when he and Pam left for a few days that we would still have plenty to talk about in relationship to the elders when he got back. Little did I know when I said that meant I would make it about 8 words into Titus chapter 1. We made it 5 verses pretty quick. And then we got slowed down, and we're now kind of still in verse 6. But we're almost done with verse 6, and we're going to move on from verse 6, Lord willing, here in just a few minutes. But we've been trying to talk about this, and as you recall, I'm trying to show you on the screen, we're trying to compare what Paul taught Timothy and what Paul taught Timothy and what he taught Titus. And we've literally laid those 2 passages beside each other on the screen. So to my right, on that side of the screen, is Titus chapter 1. On that side of the screen is 1 Timothy chapter 3. And we'll compare those 2 passages as we have been over the last couple of classes in working through these matters. We have talked already at length about the idea of him being the husband of one wife. We discussed the meaning and significance of that. We have talked very extensively about being faithful or having faithful children. And what does that mean? And we talked about last week in particular how it can, according to 1 Timothy 3, have the idea of these children being in subjection to him. Because the idea is if he's not ruling his own house well, how can he rule over the house of God? But we also talked about the fact that his ability to lead his family towards Jesus is also going to be an indication of his ability to lead others to stay focused on their relationship with Jesus. And again, we talked about that concept of what it meant to have faithful, in that particular word, faithful children. Then at the end of our study on Sunday, we began to talk a little bit about the idea of the word children. And the ultimate question that comes out of that is, if a person has one child, can they meet the qualification of an elder if they only have one child? Now, we shared with you Sunday morning that there are 2 basic Greek words you're dealing with, tekna and teknon. One is the singular form, child, the other being the plural form, children. And we talked about the fact that the word children is used in many passages because it's the accommodative word needed. It wouldn't make much sense if you said to somebody, do you have child? We rarely ask anybody, do you have child? What do we ask them? Do you have children? And if they have one, is the answer yes or no? The answer is yes, right? The answer is yes. If you say to a person, do you have children? And they have only one child, they would still answer that question in the affirmative. Yes, I have one child. They might define it for you and they might tell you, but the answer to the question is yes. We illustrated that by looking at what Paul had taught Timothy concerning the widows. And concerning those widows, he said what? If they have children or grandchildren, let them take care of those widows first, and let not the church be charged. And we made the illustration that I don't know of anybody that would argue that if that parent only had one child, that one child doesn't have to honor that passage because the passage said children. We would say, no, the writer meant children because that's the accommodative word necessary to make that definition. And if they only had one child, that one child would be just as obligated to the text as if they had 20 children. And I simply made the illustrative point that if it's true in relationship to that text, I believe you can make the same basic principled argument here in this text. That children here isn't the idea of just making sure he has a bunch of them, a plurality of them, but that he has children, that he has at least a child, that you're able to look how he rules his house, not just his relationship to his wife, but also his relationship to those who are within his household, and how he's ruled well over them and is able to lead them as evidence as to whether he can lead in the house of God. I'm not dogmatic about that, by the way. If a congregation was having trouble over that issue, if there was dissension and challenge and difficulty I wouldn't press and push and just demand that people be persuaded by those arguments. I'm just telling you what I have concluded in my own personal study of the idea of children and how that fits in this narrative. Nor would I try to press a man who maybe in his own conscience has already decided in his mind that that word means he needs to have more than one. And if he has decided in his mind that he needs to have more than one and he doesn't, then I certainly wouldn't press that individual to try to change their conscience about that in relationship to those things. That's the quick summation I could give you of the things that we've already talked about leading up to this point. Are there any leftover questions or thoughts concerning any of that? Well, good. Means we're move on. So we've discussed these family things. They can't be riotous and unruly. That's the subjection part you see in 1 Timothy chapter 3. All of that is the evidence that he can rule his own house. Again, we've had discussions about that. Although for anybody who happened to be homesick or anything last week, we didn't realize that the mic didn't get punched on to the live streaming last Sunday morning, and so somebody actually thumbed up, liked the fact that they didn't hear me when they were watching that video. I'm not sure whether somebody was anyway, but I thought that's quite interesting. But so there was no recorded connection last week in our study, so I wanted to make sure if there were any questions we allowed for that. All right, so let's go into Titus 1 then. We've talked about that family connection. Now let's talk about some other things. Because it's not just about his family, right? It's about his family, and it's about what? His personal character. Okay. His personal character is crucial in this conversation. And he's going to have to recognize the accountability to that. For a bishop or an elder must be, according to Titus 1:7, he must be blameless as the steward of God, not self-willed, not soon angry, not given to wine, no striker, not given to filthy lucre. Now let's break those down for a minute. We've talked already about the idea of blameless, right? We talked about it earlier in our study. About the idea there probably ought not be any accusations against him, especially if they're unresolved, if they haven't been concluded and illustrated as being false, then we may want to be careful if there's some kind of accusation being charged against a man who's being considered to be an elder, and work through those things before he's appointed. There could be some false accusations, by the way. It's absolutely possible that somebody just is determined they don't want a particular individual to serve in that capacity, and they could bring up all kinds of accusations and falsehoods that a church might have to address and deal with. But be that as it may, if he's not blameless, then he's probably not fit to serve, and ought to work towards becoming blameless in relationship to any thoughts that might be against him in that sense. And then he says, for a bishop must be blameless as the steward of God. What's a steward mean? Okay, an oversees something, right? And sometimes the Bible speaks of elders as overseers. And so he's going to have to be someone who's able to look out and oversee and be a good steward over the responsibilities that God gives him. For lack of a better description, he's going to have some management skill. And I don't mean that he could go run a business somewhere necessarily, but what I mean by that is that he's going to have some level of organization about it, so that he's able to maintain and steward over the responsibilities that he's going to have within a local assembly. Now, the benefit is that the Bible always speaks of elders in the what? In the plural, right? And he always speaks about elders, appoint elders. That is plural when we see it. There's no teknon when it comes to that aspect. And because there's wisdom in that, because an eldership as a whole may lean on each other for the strong suits that they bring into that work and purpose. But he's going to have to be able to be a good steward over the responsibilities that he's given. If he's lacking in his ability to steward over things that he's already been given responsibility to, then he may struggle with the amount of responsibility he's going to have as an elder. I've never believed in the work of a deacon as being the minor league, if you will, of prepping a person to become an elder. I've never believed in that concept. But I do recognize that it certainly is a good way for a person to become and learn how to be a good steward. Because as a deacon, that individual might be given simpler, maybe a very good word, but fewer responsibilities, and he can work on how it is that he can own up to those responsibilities and demonstrate to the congregation that he's able to handle those lesser in amount responsibilities that might give some evidence of his being a steward of God. And so again, not necessarily a prerequisite, but certainly something could be learned on how they handle those responsibilities first.
See that the truth is taught.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of responsibilities that are going to be within within his care, and he's going to have to take ownership of those things.
Sometimes they have to make a lot of decisions that will affect the whole congregation.
Yeah. And notice he said, as the steward of who? As the steward of God. Who's he ultimately answer to? He ultimately answers to God. Okay, I think sometimes maybe congregations get in their mind that the elders answer to the members. They have accountability to the members, but at the end of the day, the elder's ultimate responsibility is to their God. And the way he handles those responsibilities, his first priority is to make sure that he's honoring what God would want from him before anything else can be considered or thought of. His stewardship is first in connection to God. What else must he not be? Cannot be self-willed. What's it mean to be self-willed? Yeah. The disposition of my way or the highway is not becoming of one who wants to serve as an elder. That's what the Apostle Paul just said here. If his personal thoughts about things always override anything else that may come up or it needs to be addressed, if self is his first thought process, then he ought not be appointed, number one, and he ought not serve in that capacity. A man who's self-willed it means he's looking out for himself first, is not going to be very sacrificial when it comes to the sheep, right? He's not going to be all that forthcoming when it comes to getting out and doing all that he can to take care of the lambs when his first interest is himself. It's not only an unbecoming characteristic of any child of God, because the truth is, all of us have the same accountability to God in relationship to this kind of subject matter. Every child of God needs to be careful not to become self-willed. But in particular, you can understand how that is going to create a challenge. I want you to recognize and think for a minute with me. Are there some things that are going to be pretty objective? Meaning, here's what the Bible said about it. In other words, it's not hard for the elder to understand that we have to preach, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, he that believeth not shall be condemned, right? That's an objective piece of information that cannot change. And so he's going to have to show his leadership in maintaining that the purity of that gospel message, the purity of the doctrine of Christ that can be evidenced objectively from God's testimony of Scripture, is honored and respected in relationship to what Jim mentioned a while ago. But a lot of what elders have to do isn't as black and white as that. A lot of the decisions they have to make are sometimes better and best. Here are two things, and if you're talking about their doctrinal approval, they both may fit the doctrine of Christ. And I've got to make a decision between these two things. And one may be the best decision over that which is a might be considered better. My point simply is this. There is some subjective judgment that is taking place among the work of elders. There are a lot of things that aren't told us. The Bible doesn't speak in precise ways about how it is we're going to go into all the world and preach the gospel. We know we have to go. We know we have to preach the gospel. But elders are going to have to lead and make choices and decisions about how it is the church collectively fulfills that responsibility. When it comes to when we gather for worship, we know upon the first day of the week. But beyond that, right, they have to make some judgments and decisions about what's going to work for the congregation. And my point is simply this: because there is some subjective decisions that have to be made, some judgment decisions that have to be made by elders, it would not be wise to have a self-willed man in that capacity. Because he's going to be looking for his own personal interest when it comes to those subjective decisions. When really he maybe needs to look out for what is best for the flock he's serving. May not always be what's best for him. It may not always be what might be the personally best and most advantageous thing for him personally. But if it benefits the whole in a better way, he's going to have to be willing to set aside the self-will and do what's best for the group. And we need men who are willing to do that in that responsibility. I'll come back to him. Go ahead, Bob. If you're talking about subjective things, you're talking about opinions and judgment. And we're not talking about something that the Bible has clearly stated. Then I don't know what else you're going to do. If you have, because you've got a plurality, and if they need to come to some kind of consensus at times on subjective matters and particular matters of judgment, they're going to have to come to some kind of understanding. And again, employing what Paul said, think not of your own self, but think of others. And they may have to, there's going to be some give and take sometimes in relationship to those subjective matters.
One thing I have in mind, I know this has come up in other churches before, and that is the divorce.
Yeah.
Whether or not that divorce states that it was because of adultery. Because lots of employers anymore say, this is the quickest way, so we'll just use this term in the divorce proceeding.
Yeah.
And you got one guy who's holding fast to the fact that it has to say adultery. That's what I was.
Right. And there are some pretty tricky issues that come up sometimes. And what I would and you will have a problem if you've got a self-willed guy who's bent on certain, certain subjective things. Certainly in that particular issue, there are solid principles that need to be understood. And certainly we need to understand the base principles, and that is one man for one woman for life. And let not man put asunder what God has joined together, and except fornication is the leading cause. But yeah, elders sometimes are going to have to put aside maybe some. Yeah.
Maybe it won't be.
Yeah, they're
some people would think that's none of your business.
Right. There's going to have to be a willingness in some ways for them to look in and make a decision about what really happened here, because you cannot trust a legal system or hearsay to really tell you what went on in a circumstance. And so those kinds of things will come up, and they have to be the kind of men who have the character that will work through those things. Yeah. Did you have something, Jim?
Is that one reason they say not to be a novice? Messing with the younger men. Sometimes they're person's more experienced and probably make a better decision person is young.
Well, it's possible. I've seen a lot of self-willed old people, though. A lot of them. I'm not looking at you when I say that, by the way. I'm trying not to look at anybody else since you asked the question. I don't think that. So I don't know. I've always felt that the novice idea is he's just not prepared enough. I've seen a lot of novice people who are very sacrificial, and there's not a self-willed bone in them. And I've seen a lot of older people that if you stood them right and showed them my shirt and said it was solid color, or I said it's striped and they said it was solid color, they'd argue with me all night. You know what I mean? And so I don't know that necessarily has any particular connection to self-willed or not, but it does have a connection to the whole picture of whether they're prepared in all of these areas to serve. And I don't have to give you anecdotal. I could give you all kinds of anecdotal evidence of elderships that I've read about and have had distant connections. And that's, notice I qualified that, distant connections, meaning none that I've directly, personally, necessarily worked with, but because of a self-willed man here or there, and not only do they hold the eldership hostage, but then they end up holding the entire congregation hostage, and it's not good. It's not good for a local assembly. He's also supposed to be what? Not self-willed, not soon angry. Some translations may not quick-tempered. Okay? An elder can't afford to be quick to react to things. We generally make mistakes when we don't take a breath, right? Sometimes you got to step back from circumstance and think about it for a minute before I say something, before I react to something, before I make the matter worse because I acted too hastily without all the facts, without all the information, without the right perspective. He cannot be somebody who is quick-tempered in that way. And he can't be easily upset because what he's going to have to deal with, unfortunately, on many occasions, is going to be upsetting. They're going to be real life issues that are going to be absolutely frustrating to those who serve in the capacity of an elder. And if they act impulsively, or if they respond too hastily, or if they're quick to get upset about certain things, they can't serve because they're going to make matters worse than they already are. There's a reason why these qualifications, all of us are supposed to be cautious about our tempers, right? All of us are supposed to let not thine anger go down, or let the sun go down on anger. These are basic principles for all children of God. They have some very specific meaning when it comes to those who are going to lead a congregation. And you take a fellow who gets angry at any whip stitch and every little thing that comes along the way, he's always seemed to be upset about something. It is not going to be the kind of leadership a congregation needs. That congregation is going to be stymied by that disposition. And it's going to be hard for them. And so if one desires this office, this work of an elder, then he's going to have to be careful about those things. It's jump to 1 Timothy 3, verse 3 for a minute. Because I think that there's some things I want to make connection to this not soon angry thought. He said, he's not a striker. He's not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient. He's not a brawler. What's it mean to be a brawler?
Fight all the time.
Right. Good elders aren't looking for a fight. Good elders are looking for results. I think sometimes maybe we have the wrong picture. Now, because here's what we say: they need to be willing to fight for truth, and they need to be willing to stand firm in doctrine, and they need and all that's true. But one who's going to serve as an elder is not somebody who relishes in a good scrap. He's not somebody who enjoys confrontation. Now, confrontation may come to him, and he may have to address it, but he's not looking for it. He's not a brawler. Elders are going to have to be good listeners. And if they're quick-tempered about things, if somebody comes to them and shares with them something they need help or assistance with, and their first reaction is to get upset with that individual over that, they're not going to be much help to them, are they? They're not going to be of much assistance in feeding that lamb what they need. If their reactions are to get angry, or if their reactions are to get and jump straight into an argument with somebody. Again, trust me, I've lived in an elder's home as a child. I have worked with numerous elders over the years in different locations, even in different areas of the country where I've worked with elders. And all of them have experienced a moment, I'm sure, where the fight came to them. They weren't looking for it. They weren't trying to create it. It came to them. But how are they going to react in that moment? And what's his response going to be? We need to be looking for men, according to what Paul said to Titus and according to what he said to Timothy. We need to be looking for men who have a calm disposition about them. They're not quick-tempered. They don't get angry quick, and they're willing to work through and try to find a resolve when the issues come. Yeah, I mean the not a brawler has more of the idea of his character of peaceableness, whereas the striker is the idea that he's not quarrelsome. He's not looking to get into arguments over things. He's not looking to quarrel, and so they have a hand in hand kind of approach. They're not identical. Yeah, they're slightly different. Yes. Yeah. The brawler would be somebody who's not peaceable, and someone who's in other words hard to get along with. It's the elders need to be people that folks can come and get along with, according to what Paul describes here in this text.
You're going to have people disagree with you.
Yeah.
How you control that? How you handle that?
Yeah, and it's a lot easier said than done, Jim. And I'll admit that even from a preaching standpoint. And it's when I was younger, and you want to attribute this to the novice, maybe it fits when it came to me anyway. But I know when I was a younger preacher, I was a lot hastier than I should have been at times. When somebody would disagree or say something. And maybe that was youth. I don't know what it was, or maybe just a disposition, character flaw that I had to work through. I'm not saying I'm completely over that, to be quite honest with you. At times we all kind of want to react and get defensive, but we've got to strive to get past those things and be willing to be more peaceable. And not everything doesn't have to turn into an argument. And sometimes maybe if we would take a step back. Maybe not have that first reaction that I want to have. And we need to find men willing to do that work to be peaceable with people and aren't looking to to get into a challenge. They're also not given to what? Not given to wine. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, someone who would give himself over to intoxication would have a hard time making some pretty sober and wise decisions, wouldn't they? Can you imagine? The phone rings in the home of an elder, and there's an issue that needs resolved. There's help that needs to be offered, and the wife has to say, well, give him a couple hours, and I'll get a pot of coffee going, right? Can you think about it? Is that really the picture that Paul would want us to be looking for? Someone who was not sober and ready to handle those things from the beginning. I know there's a lot of conversations that come out of these texts, and people want to try to turn this conversation about elders into everybody else. Well, the elder's not to be given to wine, so does that loosen up everybody else? Friends, this text isn't talking about everybody else. This text has a person in mind, and that person in mind is the man who desires to be a bishop. And the man who desires to be a bishop is not given to wine. Period. That's it. It's not about other people. And it's not about is that giving liberty to something? No, it's about the elder, and that's it. And he's not to be given to wine. And we can understand some very practical reasons why that is. Why is it good for him not to be given to filthy lucre? Yeah, and he could be influenced. And is he going to be given some access? Yeah, he's going to have some access, and he's going to have the. So if he's not legitimate in the way he handles his own affairs, if he's not legitimate in the way that he handles his own business affairs, he ought not be touching the affairs of the Lord's church. If he's greedy, that's not going to make for a very good circumstance. That's the added thought that is shared there in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 3 when he says, not given to wine, not a striker, not greedy of filthy lucre. He's not looking for illicit means by which to gain an advantage in his personal life and his personal business. Because that's not going to be a very good picture of what kind of man you would want leading the congregation. And that gets a little bit to his trustworthiness within a community and as well as among the congregation. I'll come back to you, Roger. Yeah.
And the NIV uses a lover of money.
Yeah.
Which would not necessarily mean it would be a dishonest gain, but you're willing to do whatever you do to gain money.
Yeah.
You love money more than position.
And he's going to have to lead a congregation to not lay up treasures where? On earth. He's going to have to be compelling and encouraging a congregation not to be laying up treasures on earth. And if that's what he's doing all day long, it's going to be a hard sell. It's going to be a hard message for a congregation to embrace if those who are leading it are more focused on earthly things than they are on the spiritual things. And so he's going to have to be somebody who has avoided those things. With that, add the thought, he's not in 1 Timothy 3 verse 3, right here. He's not covetous. What's it mean to be covetous, by the way?
Something somebody else has.
Okay, and that's covetous is one of the most difficult words for me to kind of define in other words, but we kind of know what it is. Desiring to pull, and I never did come back to you, Roger. I will. Desiring what other people have can create its own set of difficulties. Let me come back to Roger before I move too far. Yeah.
It didn't happen among the apostles with Jesus traveling with them.
if one of Jesus' chosen immediate disciples could fall prey to covetousness, then don't think that an elder in the Lord's church could. And so we've got to sort through some of those things. One of the most interesting things I heard a person say one time was, they said, the preacher, and here was the phrase, the preacher should not have more power than the elder. And my answer to that was, neither one of them have any power. The truth is, neither one of them have any power. All the power and authority is in the hands of who? God and His Son and His Word, right? And if you have a man who is power hungry, he's covetous over whatever it might be, the influence or that others have got, that's a dangerous man. Yeah. 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 And congregations need to be, and I guess this is as good a time as any to deal with this, but congregations need to be honest about these things. Again, we're not looking for a perfect man. We're not looking for someone who's just so flawless that his shoes squeak when he walks across the floor. But we are talking about a qualified man. And if he has tendencies to be covetous over what other people, not just their physical belongings, but he could be covetous over another elder and their relationship or connection to a congregation. That covetousness can come from all kinds of sources. And it's not who you want leading. And if he's concerned about things like the word power and who has power, I mean, if the word power even comes up, that would probably be somebody you better run away from. Because it isn't about power. It's not about I get to make the decisions. Not about power. And if it becomes that, then it shouldn't be. It's about the privilege of serving. It's about the privilege of leading. It's not about power. And covetousness will create that extra difficulty. Yeah, go ahead, Rob. No, you're fine. Yeah. When we're making these decisions about elders, when those decisions are being made, the worst thing a congregation could do would to be have conversations among themselves about their concerns over his qualifications and never have that discussion with him. And that's something that we're not very good at. And what we tend to do is we tend to just let the process be played out, and then if something arises, then we want to say, well, I knew that's exactly. But, well, if you knew that was exactly what kind of man that fellow was, then why weren't you saying that's exactly what kind of man that fellow was before he's now created a problem among the sheep? We can say things in the right way. I've tried to be cautious, but let me just give you a personal moment to illustrate it. Before I left Moundsville, I had been approached by some of the members. Our elders were aging rapidly. And I was approached by some whether I would consider serving in that capacity. And my children we've been here now for over 5 years, and so they were still pretty young. And I can remember a lady came to the house, tears in her eyes, and wanted to talk to me about. And I made a decision one way or the other, but the idea surfaced. And with tears in her eyes, her concern was the fact that my children were so young. Had there been enough time for me to evidence whether or not... Now, in some ways, she didn't realize that I was already kind of there in my thinking processes. I had already kind of drawn that conclusion myself. But I loved her for it because she didn't call anybody else. She didn't go run and talk to somebody else. She called me. And she came to the house and sat down with Deborah and I and talked to us about her concerns. And they were some similar concerns in relationship to the age of my family that I was experiencing myself. It was actually good for me to hear somebody else tell me what I was already kind of thinking at the time. And I appreciated that. I'm going to say this in a weird way. If a man who's being considered for the eldership gets upset because you came and in a peaceable way asked some questions about his qualifications, if he gets upset about that, he just proved himself not to be an elder. He just proved himself. Now, he may disagree with you, and others may disagree with your conclusions, but if he gets angry and gets upset and has the how dare you approach towards somebody coming and offering some legitimate concerns about it, then that ought to tell you right now that he's not ready to lead. He's not ready to serve in that capacity. He's going to be able to have to handle that. And we generally say he's going to have to be thick-skinned. Is that right, Gary? He's going to have to be thick-skinned. And he can't have those kind of angry reactions to things. But any legitimate man who's being considered will consider you his brother or sister in Christ if you come and express yourself with love and compassion for one another. You go and express yourself to them. If they're half the man that they need to be to even be qualified, they'll respect you for doing that. Don't wait till it becomes. Go talk to them when those moments arise. If you have some biblical concerns about that situation. So those are the things he doesn't do. But what does he do? He's a lover of what? Verse 8. Lover of hospitality. Right? He's a hospitable individual. Some of the need for a wife and some of the need for a qualified wife is part of that package. But hospitality just doesn't mean you sit down at a fellow's dinner table. Now, hospitality comes in lots of forms. Hospitality comes in a disposition of an individual. Hospitality comes in the way they treat other people. They're welcoming. The hospitality is not just about whether or not they're willing to be generous. It's a bigger picture than that. They are hospitable. They are approachable. They are welcoming individuals. An elder's going to have to be somebody that people are comfortable coming and talking to. And that's a two-way street. I think on some hands, sometimes elders have made themselves unapproachable by the way they've treated others, by the way they talk to people. It's an absolute possibility that an elder has made himself unapproachable, unhospitable towards people because of the reactions that people are aware of, the way he's reacted to various circumstances. On the other hand, there's a lot of members who just jump to the conclusion that he's unapproachable without ever even trying. They just assume it. Well, you can't go talk to him. Well, how do you know you can't go talk to him? You've never talked to him in 100 years. How have you concluded that? And so be fair with that on both sides. Most likely, if we did our job right, he's going to be a hospitable man. So approach him. But before he's appointed, if he's already kind of an unapproachable fella and people kind of walk on pins and needles around him and tiptoe, that's not the guy for the Lord's church. Right. And it's going to be part of his building a connection with people. And that bridge, if it's already built before it needs to be built, it's a lot easier to cross. If we wait till the problem arises, now here we are, we're haphazardly scrapping this bridge together, and using all the wrong tools and materials, if you will, to do it, just because we need to bridge this gap. Whereas if we work this hospitable angle to its fullest potential, then the bridges will already be built that have to be crossed. He's a lover of good men. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Because you would just assume that he's not a lover of whom? Bad men, right? You just kind of assume that. But think a little deeper than that. Who's he associate with? Who does he prefer to spend his time with? If he had his choice between, and I'm not saying he can't go bowling, but if he would choose his bowling team, or if he would choose his coworkers and the associations that he has with them over the Lord's people, is that really the fellow that you want serving? Now again, I didn't say he can't spend any time with the bowling team and he can't spend any time with his coach. But what I'm saying is, who does he love? Who does he want to spend his time with? Where's his great connection to? Lord willing, we'll be able to come back and talk a little bit. Think about that one, and we'll come back and talk about that, Lord willing, next week. Sunday, I should say. Slow down.